The Victorian Alps stretch endlessly, their towering ridges and dense forests creating a vast and unforgiving wilderness. It is a place of isolation, where the few who live and work there must contend with both the elements and the solitude. In 1917, this remote landscape became the setting for one of Australia's most enduring mysteries, a brutal, unsolved double murder that has baffled investigators and historians for over a century. At the heart of the mystery are two men, James Barclay, the well-respected manager of Wonnangatta Station, and John Bamford, a drifter with a shadowy past. Their fates would become intertwined in a way that no one could have predicted. The two men vanished from the station without a trace, leaving behind only eerie silence. Months later, Barclay's body was discovered, hastily buried in the wilderness. He had been shot in the head, executed with cold precision. Bamford, at first presumed to be the killer, also turned up dead. His body burned beyond recognition in a pile of logs. No one witnessed the murders, no clear suspects emerged. And despite extensive searches and investigations, the truth behind their deaths has remained elusive. Who killed James Barclay and John Bamford? Was it a personal feud that turned deadly, a vengeful act carried out by someone from their past? Or was there a third party involved, an unseen killer who left no trace? Over a century later, the case remains as perplexing as ever. The remoteness of Wonnangatta Station, the lack of forensic evidence, and the shifting theories surrounding the crime have only deepened the mystery. This is the story of the Wonnangatta Murders, a crime that has refused to be forgotten, buried within the vast Australian wilderness. Now, to understand what happened in those final days at Wonnangatta, we must first go back to the place itself and to the men at the center of the mystery. Deep in the Victorian Alps, Wonnangatta Station stood as a solitary outpost of civilization, nestled within a landscape as breathtaking as it was unforgiving. Surrounded by towering mountains and thick bushland, it was a place of harsh beauty, where survival depended on experience, resilience, and a deep understanding of the land. There were no roads leading to Wonnangatta, only rugged trails, winding through dense forests and treacherous river crossings. The journey to the station could take days, with only horseback travel making it possible. For those who sought escape, whether from society or from their past, this was the perfect place to disappear. James Barclay knew the land well. As the long-time manager of Wonnangatta Station, he had spent years tending to its cattle, overseeing operations and keeping the property running. It was a lonely existence, but Barclay was suited to it. He was a man of discipline and routine, respected by the cattlemen of the high country and well regarded in the small settlements that dotted the region. While he often worked alone, he occasionally hired men to assist with the daily operations. Stockmen, station hands, and drifters, men who moved from property to property, staying for a season before moving on. Some were trustworthy, others were not. In December of 1917, Barclay rode into Talbotville, a small mining town in the foothills of the Alps, to collect supplies and take care of business. It was a trip he made regularly, his way of maintaining ties with the outside world before retreating back into the isolation of the station. It was during this visit that he met John Bamford. Bamford was different from the other men Barclay had hired over the years. Unlike the seasoned cattleman of the high country, he was a drifter, a man with no real roots and few friends. His reputation preceded him. Stories of past conflicts, a short temper, and a tendency to find trouble wherever he went. He had worked on various stations before, but never for long. Something always seemed to go wrong. Despite this, Barclay extended an offer. Bamford could work at Wonnangatta as a cook and station hand, at least for the time being. Whether Barclay saw potential in the man or simply needed an extra pair of hands is unknown. But with that decision, his fate was sealed. The two men set off together, riding out of Talbotville and into the wilderness. They traveled deep into the mountains, back to the station where Barclay had lived and worked for years. The journey was long and demanding, taking them further away from civilization with each passing mile. By the time they arrived, Wonnangatta Station was once again cut off from the world. The cattle grazed in the vast paddocks. The nearby river continued its steady flow, and the station dog remained tied near the homestead, waiting for its master to return. For a time, everything seemed as it should be. Then silence. Weeks passed, and no one heard from Barclay or Bamford. It was unusual, but not immediately alarming. In the high country, it wasn't uncommon for men to go weeks, even months, without contact. The remoteness of Wonnangatta meant that those who lived there did so in near total isolation. But something was different this time. It wasn't until January of 1918 that the first signs of trouble emerged. Harry Smith, a stockman familiar with Wonnangatta, made the long journey to the station, expecting to see Barclay. Instead, he found an eerie stillness. The homestead was abandoned. The front door was open, swinging slightly in the wind. Inside, half-eaten food sat on the table, untouched for weeks. The station ledger, where Barclay recorded events and activities, held one final entry in his handwriting: "Home tonight." But Barclay was not there, nor was Bamford. Smith searched the property, calling out for the men, checking the paddocks, the sheds, the surrounding area. Nothing. The only living thing on the property was the station dog, still tied up, left behind in the same place Barclay had always kept him. Something was wrong. Smith left the station, returning days later with others. Together they searched once more, but there were no signs of struggle, no immediate evidence of what had happened. The men had simply vanished, their last moments. At the station, leaving behind only questions, word began to spread among the cattlemen and stockmen of the high country. In such an isolated place, any disappearance carried an air of unease. The station had always been remote, but now it felt different, like something had happened there, something that no one could explain. As weeks turned into months, suspicions grew. Had the two men argued? Had Bamford, known for his violent temper, turned on Barclay? Or had someone else been there, someone with a motive and the means to ensure that no one would ever know the truth? By March, the high country had begun its seasonal change. The harsh summer was giving way to cooler temperatures, the rivers running heavier with the first hints of autumn rainfall. It was then that the mystery deepened. A group of cattlemen moving through the region made a grisly discovery. Near Conglomerate Creek, 20 kilometers from Wonnangatta Station, they found a shallow grave. Inside was the decomposed body of James Barclay. His skull had been shattered by a bullet. His body had been buried hastily, as if someone had been in a hurry to get rid of him. Whoever had done this had not intended for him to be found. But if Barclay was dead, where was Bamford? The discovery sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community of the high country. The realization that Barclay had been murdered, executed, in cold blood, changed everything. If this was a crime of passion, then Bamford was the likely culprit. But if it wasn't, if there was something more to the story, then that meant something even more chilling. The killer was still out there. The search for answers intensified. Theories began to emerge. But despite their efforts, there were no clear answers, no immediate clues that pointed to what had happened in those final days at Wonnangatta. The only certainty was that Barclay was dead. Bamford was missing. And the wilderness had swallowed the truth. It would be another 8 months before the case took its darkest turn yet. The discovery of James Barclay's body in March 1918 changed everything. What had first seemed like a puzzling disappearance had now turned into a confirmed murder. The news sent ripples through the high country, where violence was rare and trust was a necessity among those who lived and worked in such an isolated region. Barclay had been buried in a shallow grave near Conglomerate Creek, his body left to decay in the remote wilderness. The state of his remains suggested he had been dead for months, likely since the time he and Bamford had last been seen. His cause of death was unmistakable, a gunshot wound to the head. The shot had been delivered with precision, execution style, leaving no doubt that this was a deliberate killing. But Barclay's body only provided part of the story. There was still the matter of John Bamford. If Bamford had killed Barclay, where had he gone? And if he hadn't, then who had killed them both? For months, speculation ran wild. Some believed that Bamford had been the murderer, that he had shot Barclay in a fit of rage and then fled into the mountains to avoid capture. Others questioned this theory. Bamford wasn't known for his survival skills, and the high country was unforgiving even for experienced cattlemen. If he had tried to escape, he would have needed supplies, a horse, and a clear destination. Yet, there were no reports of stolen provisions, no sightings of him in any nearby towns, no evidence that he had made it out of the mountains alive. If Bamford was the killer, then where was he? The mystery deepened as the months passed. Without answers, the case began to fade from active investigation, becoming more of a ghost story, a whispered tale among the stockmen and travelers who passed through the region. Then in November 1918, nearly a year after Barclay's disappearance, another discovery sent shockwaves through the community. John Bamford was dead. His remains were found in a pile of burnt logs, miles from where Barclay's body had been discovered. The fire had long since gone cold, but the damage was unmistakable. Whoever had killed Bamford had gone to great lengths to destroy his body, ensuring that little was left to be found. His bones were barely recognizable, charred beyond identification. It was only through persistence and careful examination that authorities were able to confirm that the remains belonged to the missing station hand. The manner of Bamford's death raised more questions than it answered. Burning a body wasn't just about disposal. It was an act of deliberate erasure, a way to eliminate evidence. Unlike Barclay, who had been buried quickly, Bamford's killer had taken the time to ensure his remains were almost completely destroyed. This suggested something chilling. If Bamford had murdered Barclay and then fled, it meant someone else had tracked him down and executed him. A revenge killing carried out in the depths of the Victorian Alps, far from the reach of law enforcement. But there was another possibility, one even more unsettling. What if Bamford had never killed Barclay? What if both men had been murdered by the same unknown hand? With both men dead, there were no witnesses left to explain what had truly happened. At Wonnangatta, theories emerged, each one as compelling as it was unprovable. Some believed that Bamford had been the target all along, that Barclay had simply been caught in the crossfire of a personal vendetta. Others suspected cattle thieves, bushrangers, or even an outsider with a hidden motive, someone who had stumbled upon the station and seen an opportunity. Yet the deeper investigators looked, the fewer answers they found. The remoteness of the region had worked in the killer's favor. There were no roads, no train stations, no easy routes in or out. Whoever had committed these murders had done, so knowing that the wilderness would keep their secrets. By the time Bamford's remains were found, the case had gone cold. Months had passed since the killings, and in the absence of modern forensic techniques, there was little evidence to examine. The harsh climate and the passage of time had erased any physical clues that might have led to a suspect. The high country was a place of self-reliance where justice was often handled outside the reach of official authorities. It was a land where grudges could last for years and where men who made enemies rarely lived to regret it. Some believed that Barclay and Bamford had run afoul of the wrong people, that their deaths had been planned and carried out with ruthless efficiency. But no one came forward. No confessions, no witnesses, no clear suspects. The Victorian police investigated as best they could, but with little to go on, their efforts stalled. The case remained officially unsolved, and as the years passed, it drifted further into legend. What had started as a missing persons case had become one of Australia's greatest mysteries. Two men murdered in one of the most isolated places in the country, their deaths forever shrouded in unanswered questions. The wilderness had swallowed the truth, and the mountains had kept their secrets well. Despite the passing of time, the legend of the Wonnangatta Murders refused to fade. The crime had all the elements of a classic frontier mystery, an isolated setting, a brutal execution, and a killer who had vanished into thin air. And yet, the story was far from over. Because where official investigations had failed, speculation had thrived. Theories continued to grow, passed down through generations, each one offering a different version of what might have happened that fateful winter at Wonnangatta Station. For over a century, the Wonnangatta murders have remained an enduring mystery. With no arrests, no confessions, and no definitive suspects, with both James Barclay and John Bamford dead, there were no witnesses left to tell the truth of what had really happened. The lack of physical evidence and the station's extreme isolation only deepened the puzzle. Theories began to emerge, each one offering a possible explanation, but none providing a clear answer. The most immediate and obvious theory was that John Bamford had killed James Barclay. It was a conclusion that seemed logical, at least at first glance. Bamford had a reputation for being difficult, known for his short temper and history of conflicts. It wasn't a stretch to believe that Barclay and Bamford might have argued, that something had pushed Bamford over the edge. Maybe it was a fight over work, over money, or over something more personal. Maybe it was planned, or maybe it happened in a moment of rage. But if Bamford had killed Barclay, then where had he gone? And more importantly, who had killed him? The discovery of Bamford's burned remains shattered the idea that this had been a simple case of a dispute gone wrong. If he had murdered Barclay and fled, then someone else had hunted him down. The question was, who? One possibility was that Barclay's friends had taken justice into their own hands. The high country was a place where law enforcement was scarce, and where disputes were often settled without official involvement. If the locals believed that Bamford had killed Barclay, they wouldn't have waited for the authorities to act. They would have tracked him down themselves, delivered their own form of justice, and made sure he never had the chance to explain himself. This theory was strengthened by the manner in which Bamford's body was disposed of. Burning a corpse wasn't just about getting rid of evidence. It was a symbolic act, one that sent a message. It wasn't just an execution, it was an erasure. If this was an act of revenge, then it had been carried out with cold, methodical precision. Yet there were problems with this theory. If Barclay's friends had found Bamford and killed him, why had they gone to such lengths to destroy his remains? If they had wanted to make a statement, leaving his body out in the open would have been more effective. Instead, it seemed like someone had wanted him to disappear completely. That led to another, more unsettling possibility. What if Bamford had never been the killer? What if both men had been murdered by the same person? It was a theory that couldn't be ignored. The remoteness of Wonnangatta Station made it the perfect place for a crime with no witnesses. If someone else had entered the station, if they had been waiting in the darkness for the right moment, they could have killed Barclay first, disposing of his body before turning their attention to Bamford. The idea of a third party raised even more questions. If it wasn't about personal conflict, then what was the motive? Was it about money? Cattle theft? Or was it something deeper, something hidden in the high country that no one had ever uncovered? There were whispers that Barclay had been involved in some kind of dispute before his death. Some said he had angered the wrong people, that he had become entangled in a conflict with other landowners or stockmen. In the isolated world of cattle stations, tensions over land, livestock, and resources could turn deadly. If Barclay had been caught up in something bigger than himself, then his murder might not have been about Bamford at all. Then there was the possibility of an outsider, a bushranger, a fugitive, or a drifter who had stumbled upon the station and seen an opportunity. The mountains were filled with men who had reasons to avoid the law. A desperate outlaw could have come across Wonnangatta, seen two men alone in the wilderness, and decided to take what he could. But this theory also had its flaws. There was no sign of robbery, no evidence that anything had been taken. Whoever had killed Barclay and Bamford hadn't done it for money. They had done it for a reason far more personal. The more investigators searched for answers, the more the mystery deepened. Every theory had gaps, every suspect had uncertainties. The harsh truth was that too much time had passed, and the wilderness had erased whatever clues might have remained. No gun was ever found. No tracks, no blood trails, no definitive evidence that pointed to a single suspect. The case remained frozen in time, a crime without resolution. Even the police, after months of investigation, had no clear conclusion. Officially, they treated Bamford as the most likely suspect in Barclay's murder, with his own death remaining. An unexplained mystery, but unofficially, no one was certain. To this day, the Wonnangatta murders remain one of Australia's most enduring unsolved cases. Theories continue to circulate past, down through generations, each one offering a different version of the truth. Some believe the answers are still out there, hidden in the mountains, waiting to be uncovered. Others believe the case will never be solved, that the truth died with Barclay and Bamford, lost forever in the silence of the high country. But one thing is certain: whoever committed these murders knew exactly what they were doing. They knew how to kill without leaving a trace. They knew how to make people disappear, and they succeeded. The Victorian Alps were a vast, untamed wilderness, where crimes could go unnoticed for months, sometimes years. In the case of the Wonnangatta murders, the sheer remoteness of the crime scene made investigating the deaths of James Barclay and John Bamford an almost impossible task. By the time Barclay's body was discovered in March 1918, he had already been dead for weeks, if not months. By the time Bamford's remains were found in November, nearly a year had passed since the murders likely occurred. Any trace of the killer, footprints, evidence of struggle or abandoned weapons, had long since disappeared into the elements. Investigators from the Victorian police force travelled into the high country to examine the crime scenes, but they arrived late, delayed by both the harsh terrain and the slow spread of information in such an isolated region. The process of gathering evidence was rudimentary at best. This was a time before forensic science, before DNA, before ballistics could match bullets to a specific gun. Police had little to work with other than their own observations, witness statements, and theories. The questions piled up, but answers remained elusive. The first and most pressing mystery was that of James Barclay's murder. His body, found near Conglomerate Creek, showed signs of deliberate execution. The shot to his head had been precise. The way his body had been buried suggested the killer had been in a hurry, not concerned with concealment, just with moving on. The crime had the hallmarks of a personal attack rather than a random act of violence. Then came the problem of John Bamford. If police had initially suspected him of killing Barclay, then his own death shattered that theory. Bamford's remains were discovered burned, almost as if someone had wanted to erase him entirely. It was one thing to kill a man. It was another to destroy all trace of him. The fact that his remains had been left in a pile of logs, deliberately set alight, suggested that his killer was methodical. It was not the work of someone who acted on impulse. Yet, for all their efforts, investigators struggled to piece together a coherent narrative. There were no signs of forced entry at Wonnangatta station, no reports of strangers passing through, no stolen goods that might suggest a robbery gone wrong. The cattle were untouched, the station itself left in working order. There was no evidence of prolonged violence, no clear indicators of a struggle before the men vanished. Instead, police had to rely on interviews, but there were few people to question. The nearest settlements were miles away, and the last known person to have seen Barclay alive, stockman Harry Smith, had only visited briefly before realizing something was wrong. His account provided no new leads, only confirmation that the station had been abandoned, with half-eaten food on the table and an ominous final note in Barclay's ledger: "Home tonight." Locals had their own suspicions. Some believed the murders were connected to an old feud, a conflict between station owners that had escalated into something deadly. Others thought Bamford had been the target all along, that Barclay had simply been caught in the middle. A few suspected cattle thieves, men who had killed to protect their operations in the region. But none of these theories could be proven. The limited resources of the time hindered the investigation further. The police could only cover so much ground, and the unforgiving conditions of the Alps made extensive searching difficult. They relied on stockmen and cattlemen to report anything unusual, but by the time any discoveries were made, too much time had passed. One of the biggest issues was the lack of forensic examination. The authorities could not determine the exact time of death for either man, nor could they establish with certainty whether Bamford had been dead for months or only a matter of weeks before his body was found. In modern investigations, forensic pathologists can estimate time of death based on decomposition, insect activity, and environmental factors. But in 1918, such techniques were unavailable. The case relied entirely on circumstantial evidence. Leads dried up quickly. There were no further discoveries, no new suspects, no sudden confessions. Theories about bushrangers or drifters faded without proof. The idea that Barclay and Bamford had been killed as part of an act of frontier justice remained plausible, but it was impossible to verify. Eventually, the case was left unresolved. The files remained open, but no further action was taken. With no suspects, no new evidence, and no ability to conduct a thorough forensic investigation, the authorities had little choice but to let the case slip into history. The high country moved on, and the story of the Wonnangatta murders became less an active investigation and more a legend whispered among those who traveled through the Alps. But the silence of the case did not mean it was forgotten. If anything, the lack of resolution made it all the more compelling. The more time passed, the more the story became something else, no longer just a crime, but a mystery embedded in the landscape itself. The case may have gone cold, but the questions remained. Who had killed James Barclay? Who had murdered John Bamford and set his body ablaze? And why, after more than 100 years, had the truth never been uncovered? The investigation may have failed, but the legend of the Wonnangatta murders had only just begun. More than a century has passed since the Wonnangatta murders, yet the case remains as perplexing as ever. The Australian Alps have long since reclaimed the land where Wonnangatta Station once stood, but the mystery has not faded. Theories continue to circulate, passed down through generations of stockmen, historians, and amateur detectives. Every so often, a new perspective emerges, a new interpretation of the evidence, but the fundamental questions remain the same. Who killed James Barclay and John Bamford, and why? One of the most enduring theories is that the murders were a case of frontier justice, a form of extrajudicial punishment carried out in the isolation of the high country. It was no secret that Bamford was disliked among station workers and cattlemen. His history of conflicts and volatile personality had earned him a reputation as someone who could not be trusted. If he had wronged the wrong people, stolen from them, betrayed them, or simply made an enemy of someone with power, it is possible that Barclay's murder was just the beginning. If this theory is correct, then the sequence of events takes on a chilling clarity. Perhaps Bamford did kill Barclay, whether in a fit of rage or out of some deeper motive. But if he had, the men of the high country would not have let it go unpunished. The code of the frontier was clear. Those who took justice into their own hands had to be prepared to face the consequences. Bamford's murder may have been an execution, not carried out by law enforcement, but by those who believed they were enacting justice in their own way. The deliberate destruction of his body suggests a methodical effort to erase him from existence. It was not a quick killing, it was calculated, intentional, a way of ensuring that whatever happened to him would remain a secret. But another theory suggests something different entirely, that Bamford was never the killer to begin with. If both men were murdered by a third party, then the question of motive becomes even more complex. Some have speculated that cattle theft may have played a role. In the early 1900s, rustling was a common problem, with criminals stealing livestock and selling them off for quick profit. Wonnangatta Station, in its extreme isolation, would have been an ideal target. If Barclay had discovered something he wasn't supposed to, if he had stumbled upon thieves in the act, then it is possible that he was eliminated to keep him silent. This could explain why Bamford was killed as well. If he had been a witness rather than the murderer, then he too would have posed a threat. Perhaps he was spared at first, only to be hunted down later. The difference in how their bodies were handled, Barclay's burial versus Bamford's immolation, might indicate a shift in the killer's intentions. The first murder was hurried, done in secrecy. The second was thorough, a complete eradication of evidence. There are even more speculative theories, ones that drift into the realm of folklore. Some have suggested that the murders were not carried out by stockmen or criminals at all, but by an unknown figure who had taken refuge in the mountains. The Alps were filled with drifters, fugitives, and men running from the law. Could one of them have made their way to Wonnangatta, killing both Barclay and Bamford for reasons that remain unknown? Others believe there was no rational explanation at all, that the case remains unsolved, not because of human error or lack of evidence, but because it was never meant to be solved. Some of the stockmen who lived through that time spoke of Wonnangatta as a cursed place, where things happened that could not be explained. The isolation, the eerie silence of the mountains, the way the case seemed to defy resolution, it all contributed to a legend that has grown over time. Even modern forensic experts, looking back at the case with the benefit of hindsight, struggle to come up with definitive answers. Today, investigators rely on DNA evidence, ballistics analysis, and sophisticated crime scene reconstruction techniques. But in 1918, none of these tools were available. The passage of time erased much of what could have been discovered, and by the time the authorities arrived at the crime scene, the wilderness had already begun its work. With no surviving witnesses, no physical evidence, and no confession, the Wonnangatta murders have remained an enigma. The files remain open, not because anyone expects new developments, but because the case is a piece of Australia's history. One of the great unsolved crimes that continues to fascinate, frustrate, and haunt those who study it. The area where Wonnangatta Station once stood is now part of the Wonnangatta Valley, a quiet, secluded stretch of land that draws hikers and explorers. Some go there in search of beauty, others go in search of answers. But no matter how many times the case is examined, no matter how many theories are proposed, the truth remains out of reach. It is a case defined by silence. The silence of the Mountains, the silence of the victims, and the silence of a killer who was never found. Perhaps buried somewhere in the high country, there is still a clue waiting to be uncovered. Perhaps the answer lies in an old letter, an unexamined report, a forgotten family story passed down through generations. Or perhaps the wilderness has swallowed the truth entirely, ensuring that whatever happened at Wonnangatta Station will never be known. What is certain is that two men rode into Wonnangatta in 1917. One was a respected station manager. The other was a drifter with a troubled past. Neither of them left alive, and more than 100 years later, the mountains still hold their secrets.